In the spring of 2001, Phil Condit, the chief executive officer of Boeing Company, stood before the city of Seattle and delivered the kind of news that company towns are never quite prepared for. Boeing was leaving. Not the factories, not the engineers, not the 50,000 workers who still reported to plants in Everett and Renton every morning. Just the leadership, the executives, the board, the corporate headquarters that had sat in the Seattle area for 85 years. The destination was Chicago. The decision, Condit explained, was strategic. A global company needed a neutral home. Seattle, apparently, was not neutral enough. This is the story of how a company town learns to survive when the company decides to leave, and what happens when the distance between the boardroom and the factory floor becomes too great to bridge. What Condit did not say was this: in moving the executives away from the engineers, Boeing had begun a process of separation that would take 2 decades to fully play out, and that would end in catastrophe for the aircraft, for the people who flew them, and for the relationship between one of the world's most powerful companies and the city that built it. This is the story of how Boeing made Seattle, and what Seattle lost when Boeing decided to leave. William E. Boeing was not an engineer. He was a timberman, wealthy, methodical, and obsessed with possibility. In the spring of 1916, on the southern shore of Lake Union in the middle of Seattle, he launched a small seaplane he had helped design and build in a converted boat shed with a Navy officer named Conrad Westervelt. The plane was called the B&W seaplane. It flew, and Boeing, watching it lift off the water, understood immediately what he had found. He founded Pacific Aero Products Company that same year, later renaming it Boeing Airplane Company. He set up permanent operations along the Duwamish River south of downtown, a flat industrial corridor close to deep water, connected to rail, removed enough from the city center to allow expansion. The location was practical. The timing was exceptional. Seattle in 1916 was a young industrial city trying to find its second act. The gold rush decades had passed. The timber boom had peaked. The city was a port, a gateway, a working-class grid of neighborhoods pressed between Puget Sound and Lake Washington. What it was not yet was a place that built things of lasting global consequence. Boeing changed that. Not immediately. The early years were modest, cyclical, and often difficult. Boeing himself left his own company in 1934, forced out by federal antitrust actions that dismantled the aviation conglomerate he had built. But the company held. The engineers stayed. The Duwamish facilities grew. And when the greatest industrial mobilization in human history arrived in 1941, Boeing and Seattle were positioned to become something neither had imagined. The Second World War made Boeing, and Boeing made Seattle. Between 1941 and 1945, Boeing's Puget Sound facilities produced more than 6,000 B-17 flying fortresses, the heavy bomber that pounded German industrial targets from English airfields. And then it produced the B-29 Superfortress, a pressurized long-range strategic bomber of such mechanical complexity that it required manufacturing tolerances and engineering systems that had never been attempted at production scale. To build these aircraft, Boeing needed workers. Tens of thousands of them. Workers poured into Seattle from across the Pacific Northwest, from the interior, from states that had little to offer in a wartime economy and a lot to offer Boeing. Women entered the manufacturing floors in unprecedented numbers. Neighborhoods were laid out to house the influx. Schools were built. Infrastructure was extended. The city's population swelled because Boeing demanded it. By the end of the war, Boeing employed more than 50,000 people in the greater Seattle area. But the more important number was not the count, it was the density. Boeing was not one employer among many. Boeing was the employer. Its wages set the floor for the region. Its procurement contracts fed hundreds of supplier businesses across King County and beyond. Its engineering culture attracted technical talent that multiplied through universities, machine shops, and adjacent industries. The post-war decades deepened the relationship. The 707 debuted in 1958, America's first commercially successful jetliner, a wide-body passenger aircraft that made transatlantic flight routine for the middle class and permanently altered the geography of human movement. The 727 followed. The 737 followed that. And then, in 1967, Boeing broke ground on a factory 40 miles north of Seattle, in a town called Everett, Washington. The factory was built to assemble a single aircraft, one so large that existing facilities could not contain it. When the building was completed, it was the largest structure on Earth by volume. It still holds that title today. And the aircraft it was built to produce, the 747 jumbo jet, introduced commercially in 1970, opened the era of mass international air travel. The 747 made it possible for ordinary families to cross oceans. It democratized a thing that had been, for most of human history, impossible. It was made in Seattle, by Seattle workers, engineered by Seattle engineers, in a company whose identity and the cities were, by now, indistinguishable. At its peak, Boeing employed over 100,000 people in the Puget Sound region. That number understates the depth of the dependency. For every direct Boeing employee, multiple jobs existed to support them, in aerospace supply chains, in service industries, in the restaurants and shops and schools of communities that had organized themselves around the assumption that Boeing would always be there. Seattle was not a company town in the narrow sense that Hillsborough was an Intel town or Beaverton was a Nike town. Seattle was larger, more diverse, more established, but it was a Boeing city in the way that mattered most. Its economic identity, its working-class culture, its sense of what it produced and why it mattered were all built on the foundation that Boeing had laid. Puget Sound families had Boeing in their blood. Fathers who had worked the B-17 lines had sons who worked the 737 lines. The company was not an abstraction. It was the job, and the job was the life, and the life was Seattle. The first serious fracture came in 1971. Boeing had overextended. The commercial aviation market collapsed in the early 1970s as the post-war growth cycle stalled. A federal supersonic transport program Boeing had been counting on was canceled by Congress, and in 18 months, from 1969 to 1971, Boeing's Washington state workforce fell from just over 100,000 to fewer than 38,000. 60,000 jobs gone. Seattle's unemployment rate hit 13%. Home values fell. Population declined for the first time in the modern city's history. Small businesses that had built themselves around Boeing wages folded. The human damage was concentrated in working-class neighborhoods that had no alternative economic floor. Two Seattle real estate agents, Bob McDonald and Jim Youngren, put up a billboard near the airport. The billboard read, "Will the last person leaving Seattle please turn out the lights?" The message was dark. It was also accurate. And it contained a warning that the city chose, for the next 30 years, not to fully absorb. Boeing recovered. The 737 kept selling. The 747 found its market. Seattle rebuilt. Employment at Boeing climbed again through the late 1970s and the 1980s, and by the 1990s, the company had returned to dominance. The billboard was remembered as a historical artifact, a moment of crisis that had passed. What the billboard had actually recorded was a structural truth. A city built entirely on a single company has no protection when that company contracts. The lesson of 1971 was not that Boeing would always come back. The lesson was that betting everything on Boeing was a risk that Seattle had chosen to accept, and would keep choosing to accept until it no longer had a choice. In 1997, Boeing merged with McDonnell Douglas. McDonnell Douglas was a St. Louis-based defense contractor that had been slowly losing ground to Boeing and Airbus for years. The merger was, in structural terms, Boeing absorbing a weakened competitor. But the cultural result was the opposite. The leadership and financial philosophy that McDonnell Douglas brought into the combined company was not absorbed by Boeing's engineering culture. It absorbed Boeing's engineering culture instead. McDonnell Douglas had been run for years according to a philosophy that prioritized financial metrics, shareholder returns, and cost optimization above engineering judgment. Harry Stonecipher, who had served as McDonnell Douglas Chief Executive Officer before the merger and became Boeing's President and Chief Operating Officer in its aftermath, was the primary carrier of that philosophy into the new company. The executives who came through that system believed that the job of a manufacturing company was to manage its financials and that the engineering would follow. This was not Boeing's tradition. Boeing had been built by engineers who believed that if you built the right airplane, the financials would follow. The two worldviews collided inside the merged company, and the financial worldview won. In 2001, 4 years after the merger, Boeing's board voted to move corporate headquarters from Seattle to Chicago. 3 finalists had been considered: Chicago, Dallas, and Denver. Seattle, where Boeing had been headquartered for 85 years, was not a finalist. The stated rationale was optics. A neutral headquarters would signal to investors, customers, and governments around the world that Boeing was a global enterprise, not a regional one. Chicago offered proximity to financial institutions and major airports. The logic was presentable. The actual consequence was harder to measure, but more important. Boeing's senior leadership, the people who approved programs, set timelines, allocated budgets, and decided how much risk was acceptable, were now physically separated from the people who built the planes. The executives were in a downtown Chicago high-rise. The engineers were in Everett and Renton, 1,200 miles away. In manufacturing, proximity matters. Not because executives need to walk the factory floor every day, but because proximity produces a certain kind of accountability. When leadership lives inside the culture of the thing being made, the decisions they make are informed by that culture. When leadership lives somewhere else, decisions are made at a different remove, measured differently, rationalized differently, insulated from the daily reality of what a production line can and cannot absorb. Seattle workers felt it immediately. Veterans of the company described a shift in the company's center of gravity, from technical excellence toward financial performance, from building the best airplane toward building the most profitable one. Jim McNerney, who became Boeing's CEO in 2005 and held the role for a decade, deepened that trajectory, accelerating outsourcing, tightening cost controls, and reinforcing a culture in which quarterly results carried more weight than engineering cycles. The change was not instantaneous and not absolute, but it was directional, and the direction was away from Seattle. The distance between Chicago and Everett expressed itself most catastrophically in the 737 MAX. By the early 2010s, Airbus had developed a new, fuel-efficient version of its A320 narrow-body aircraft, the Airbus A320neo, and was winning orders from airlines that Boeing had considered loyal customers. Boeing needed a competitive response. The engineering answer would have been a new aircraft design, built from the ground up to incorporate modern engine and aerodynamic technology. That process would take 10 years and cost $20 billion. Boeing's leadership chose a different path. They would re-engineer the existing 737 airframe, a design that dated to the 1960s, and certify it as a variant of an existing type, avoiding the full recertification process that a new design would require. The strategy would save years and billions. It would satisfy the financial timelines that Wall Street had come to expect. The re-engined 737 MAX had a problem. The new, larger engines changed the aircraft's handling characteristics in ways that the original airframe had not been designed to accommodate. Boeing addressed this not by redesigning the airframe, but by installing a software system, the Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System, known as MCAS, that would automatically push the nose down if sensors detected a stall-prone pitch angle. MCAS was not adequately disclosed to regulators. It was not adequately explained to airlines. Pilots were not trained on it, and it relied on data from a single sensor, meaning that if that sensor malfunctioned, the system would push the aircraft into a dive regardless of what the pilots did. The FAA Organization Designation Authorization Program, which allowed Boeing to self-certify much of its own safety analysis, meant that the flaws in MCAS received far less independent scrutiny than they warranted. On October 29th, 2018, Lion Air Flight 610 went down into the Java Sea, 13 minutes after takeoff from Jakarta. All 189 people aboard were killed. On March 10, 2019's Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302 crashed 6 minutes after takeoff from Addis Ababa. All 157 people aboard were killed. 346 people died in 2 crashes caused by the same failure. A software system installed to compensate for a design compromise, driven by a competitive timeline, and authorized by leadership that was measuring performance in quarters rather than in engineering cycles. Dennis Muilenburg, Boeing's CEO through both crashes and the grounding that followed, became the public face of a company that had known about the risks of MCAS and had chosen, at each decision point, not to slow down. Congressional investigations, internal documents, and sworn testimony from Boeing employees described a company in which engineers who raised safety concerns were sidelined, in which the pressure to meet delivery schedules overrode the engineering process, in which the distance between the people who decided and the people who built had grown from geographic to cultural. The 737 MAX was grounded globally for 20 months. Boeing paid billions in settlements, fines, and compensation. Its reputation with regulators, airlines, and the traveling public suffered damage that remains unresolved. The crashes were not Boeing's last crisis. On January 5, 2024, Alaska Airlines Flight 1282 experienced a door plug blowout shortly after takeoff from Portland. A section of fuselage installed by supplier Spirit Aerosystems tore free at altitude and left a gaping hole in the side of the aircraft. Investigators found that the bolts meant to secure the plug had never been installed at all. Each investigation pointed back to the same root, a corporate culture in which financial logic had displaced engineering logic, one decision at a time. Boeing's manufacturing base is still in Washington state. The Everett and Renton factories still operate. Tens of thousands of workers still report to them, but the trajectory of the past 20 years has been unmistakably one of retreat. Boeing's Puget Sound workforce, which exceeded 100,000 at its peak, has fallen to roughly 50,000 and continues to contract. Production crises have led to rolling layoffs. Supply chain failures have slowed the line. The headquarters moved again in 2022 from Chicago to Arlington, Virginia, 6 miles from the Pentagon. Boeing's center of gravity has shifted decisively from the place that builds its aircraft to the place where its defense contracts are negotiated. In 2026, Boeing Defense, Space, and Security relocated its headquarters to St. Louis. The company that William Boeing built on the shores of Lake Union now conducts its most consequential leadership functions approximately 2,000 miles from the city where it began. Seattle, for its part, has survived the departure in ways the city of 1971 could not have imagined. Amazon, Microsoft, and a dense technology economy have rebuilt the city's economic foundation so thoroughly that Boeing's decline registers as a historical transition rather than an active emergency. The waterfront neighborhoods, the innovation economy, none of it depends on Boeing anymore. But the transformation of Seattle from a Boeing city into a tech city is not a vindication of Boeing's choices. It is a measure of how completely Boeing forfeited its claim to the city it built. The engineers who remain in Everett and Renton work for a company whose leadership has never lived among them. The factories that changed the shape of the modern world are managed by executives who chose, 23 years ago, to be somewhere else. William Boeing died in Seattle in 1956. He had been gone from his own company for 22 years, pushed out by regulators who broke up the aviation empire he had assembled. But he never left the city. He had built something real there, and he understood that the thing could not be separated from the place. The company that bears his name completed, over the following 7 decades, a departure he could not have anticipated. The headquarters left, the leadership left, the culture left. The aircraft that came after, the ones that crashed, the ones that failed inspection, the ones that rolled off production lines months late, were the products of a company that had put distance between itself and the people who knew how to build things right. Seattle still makes Boeing's planes. It just doesn't make Boeing's decisions. And in the gap between those two facts, the factory that stayed and the leadership that left, is the whole story of what a company OWS the city that built it, and what happens when it decides the debt is paid. Boeing built Seattle. Then, one decision at a time, it walked out. The planes are still flying. The city is still standing. But the relationship that made both of them great is gone, and no headquarters move in any direction will bring it back.